and if you're wondering where your Judge Sabo is, um, his reading of authority, it is coming back. But since it is a massive piece, we are taking a break to go through another piece. This one fairly contemporaneous. We are talking about Alex Hochuli's Omelets with Eggshells on the Failure of the Millennial Left, where Alex Hochuli reviews The Death of the Millennial Left, Interventions 2006 to 2022 by Chris Catrone. If We Burn, The Mass Protest Decade and the Missing Revolution by Vincent Bevins. And The Populist Moment, The Left After the Great Recession by Arthur Borriello and Anton Jaeger. Now, one, I've interviewed Alex on this show twice. Chris Catrone, I was in his organization from 2011 to 2013. He's been on the show at least once. He'll probably be on the show again in the future. And he works for my former employer over at Sublation Magazine. Vincent Bevins, I have not interviewed and do not know, although he has been on Fringe shows. I have not been as impressed by his speaking on his shows, but I have read some interesting stuff by him on journalism. I tend to I'm gonna admit that I have a slight bias against his answers and slightly bias against some of his analysis because I actually lived in some of the places he writes about as a teacher and just a person who living there as opposed to a journalist. So my perspective on, say, Egypt and post-Tahrir is actually kind of different than his because I think he brackets out some key bits of information. I also lived in South Korea, which he writes about as well. But there's some interesting insights that Bevins has that I will go into. And then I've also had Anton Jaeger on the show. So I cannot be said to be unbiased on this one. Furthermore, part of the series that, this show is based off is the failure of the millennial left. In so much that I think about talking about the millennial left as a generational cohort is coherent. Now, there's a lot of pushback on me talking about generational cohorts. And frankly, yes, I realize generational cohorts were mostly a marketing thing, with the exception of the baby boom, which was a very real physical phenomenon. It is somewhat arbitrary. The idea, however, that it doesn't matter or that it only affects Americans or this, that, or the other is both A, lazy, and B, forgets that social constructs have effects because they're constructed, not because they somehow magically exist in some categories and not others, just because that's what you want. The millennial left we can define as the left wing that existed after the alter globalization movement, mostly composed of people who entered this period in their late teens, early 20s, right after the Obama administration began, and are now entering their mid 30s to early 40s, like yours truly, etc. Now, Alex Hochuli is a host of Off Bunga Bunga, a host, one of three, I believe. And like I said, a friend of the show, a person I like quite personally. I'm not going to pretend to be unbiased. We disagree on things, and some of those disagreements are going to come up in my discussion of this piece. And I've already mentioned my other relationships. I've interviewed Anton Jaeger at least once, if not twice. I guess I could check. So both the author and half of the book authors have been on the show. All right. I'm going to share the text with you so you can see what's going on. This has been published in American Affairs and made available. I'm going to include the link in the show note. I may, in this series, because this is going to be a little longer, this is a longer piece, and I have a lot to say on it because I am very much involved in this situation. I have been doing podcasts since 2011. My first podcast that I was a host was 2012 with Nicholas Pale, who would later write for Talking Mag and Abandon the Left, and Douglas Lane, who I would work with in several incarnations of Diet Soap Zero books, and occasionally I've been a guest over at Sublation. So I've been covering this for a long time. I've been part of left podcasting before I even came back to the United States. In fact, arguably, I left podcasted for almost 6 years before I was back in the U.S. And so the first half of the millennial left, I experienced abroad. Or I experienced its very nascent beginnings with the alter globalization movement, kind of beginning with this battle for Seattle forward, which I experienced in a very different way than most people, being initially involved on the left and then being part of the dissident right, but still in the anti-war movement, and then going back to the left in 2005 when I predicted that the economy was going to take a tank as well. Now, there's a lot to talk about here. So let's get to it. This may be 3 or 4 episodes. I have actually recorded this before, but lost all the audio. It was corrupted. So if I seem like I'm not responding to this on a word by word basis and have been familiar with it, it's because I read it once and then read it again out loud. And this is the 3rd time. But let us begin. Alex sends, we failed. We millennials missed a historic political opportunity in the long decade following the 2008 crash. Quote, at least we tried. We could say with some justice, asterisk. Yes, you could. Although I think some of the mythology is that the Gen X left did not try, which I don't think is true. I think the Gen X left is doomed by a couple things. It was a small generation. It happened in a time period in which political socialism was discredited because of the fall of the Soviet Union, something that's kind of dropped, and the seeming liberalization of the markets of the Chinese economy and the Vietnamese economy, the stagnation of the DPRK's economy, and the kind of weird quasi-liberalization / rough patch of the Cuban Revolution's economy. So the horizon of history seems short. There's a tendency to pretend like the Fukuyama adage about the end of history was just some kind of made up myth. Alex Hochuli talks about this in here as well. I'm going to push back on that because one, what Fukuyama was indeed talking about is still around, aka liberalism is still normative, and what is surviving of liberalism is its atomized individualism in specific. But B, it was also claimed about the war period and the anti-war movement, which I think is under discussed as both a key issue for the Gen X left as it's aged and seemingly turned to various different scenarios. Matt Taibbi, Glenn Greenwald and whatnot, representing the popular manifestation of that in the foreign policy. A lot of those people seeming very right wing now. But anyway, after all, the generation that came of the age in the 1990s didn't even do that. Asterisk, I think that's both true and unfair. 1998, Battle for Seattle did kick off this whole thing after all. But raised as we were in reality, TV tropes about the participation from about participants rising from obscurity and taking their dramatic shot at success. I mean, asterisk. I mean, that's true for Gen Xers too, and to a lesser degree, maybe even for baby boomers. I think this explanation of cultural touchstone stuff is always overstated. Something I might have a mild critique of Alex on. Very mild critique. I mean, it's not that he's wrong that millennials are raised on this. They're just not the only ones. A generation whose older cohort certainly can recite by heart Eminem's lyrics about getting only one shot. I can't, and I am part of the older cohort, but that's just because I'm manifestly uncool. I listen to Aesop Rock more than Eminem. One would have expected better. Then again, we're also the generation of participation trophies. I mean, you know, that's a fun little meaningless clip. I didn't get a participation trophy, motherfucker. All right. The 2010s was a protest decade, the populist decade, when the end of history of the long 1990s came to an end. I mean, I think the end of history of the long 1990s came to an end with 9/11, and I think it's weird that this is bracketed out of this discussion. And that's going to be something I find incredibly frustrating through this entire essay and the books that are around it. It was a proto-revolutionary moment, as discomforting or cringe as it might be to think in such terms. Well, I mean, one of the things that you have to ask yourselves, was it proto-revolutionary? And if we're going to take Lenin's things about proto-revolutionary being objective or subjective, in which way was it? Was it subjectively proto-revolutionary, objectively proto-revolutionary, both but at different times, both but failed in both? There's a lot of ways in which we can interpret that just through that rubric alone. And I think we need to interpret it through that rubric. But anyway, Next paragraph. Self-conscious willed political change doesn't come out of the blue, but neither is it solely the product of incremental building. It is the product of both organization and spontaneity. Marxists have long known this, motivated by the notion of preparing and waiting for the next crisis. So did the original neoliberals, whose Mount Pelerin Society laid the intellectual groundwork for a new political economic order decades in advance of the crisis of Fortis Keynesianism in the 1970s. Yes and no. I mean, they were developing that from the 1950s forward, but they also were seeing what they were doing as continuations of that. And I think that's a misreading by Nick Shrinick and Alex Williams. Nick Shrinick was on my show, Symptomatic Redness, actually, right after Occupy, because, you know, his left futurism vision was very popular. And it was quickly eclipsed, however, by the move towards Bernie Sanders and the new social democratic / populist movement. All right. Nick Shrinick and Alex Williams list the authors urge the left to imitate the Mount Pelerin Society, tool up, and await the opportunity. I mean, in some ways, the new left descendants and the baby boomers did that. I mean, that's what Bernie did effectively. So, I mean, way to miss that someone's taking your own advice, just not you. Published in 2015, Inventing the Future was already too late for the immediate post-2008 period in the wave of protests it generated. Yes, but it's kind of actually, I think, invoked was an interesting transitional period as what was going through people's heads through that first, like, David Graeber-esque, Marco Albert-esque post-alter globalization, ab busters era of leftism that had come out of the anti-war movement and was moving in the economic protests, but was still using like 90s level, almost zine culture kind of aesthetics and appeal that kind of relied on the state actor to make it popular, i.e., you know, arresting pretty white girls that get on the New York Times. I think that is an interesting problem because it shows that there's a continuity between the quote generation that didn't do anything, the Gen X left, and the millennial left that's a lot more material than it means to realize. So what you almost have with the way this goes through with the quote millennial leftists and is that you have this movement from mimicking the immediate past to mimicking the slightly older past. So trying to rebuild the stalled social democratic organs of the end of Fordism and the new left, which come to power with literal representatives from that time periods aging into, you know, where they were in the 1980s. And there's some of these post-mortems, and particularly the Vincent Bevins one, which seems to blame this on, you know, horizontalism almost alone or neo-anarchism or whatever, infecting everyone. And also some pretty trenchant and smart critiques of the media. One of the things I'll say about Bevins when we get to that is that he suffers from being a journalist more than a historian. And it's hard to blame someone for what they are, but when you're looking at long historical trends, being a journalist is both a benefit in that you're usually a kind of academic generalist, and a disadvantage in that you're often not encouraged to think about things in long durée histories. Now, Bevins has written some good histories. I mean, the Jakarta method is actually a pretty good history as far as it goes, but he's primarily a journalist, and it shows. Anyway, back to the I'm getting ahead of myself. The moment was already upon us. The year Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the UK Labour Party and Bernie Sanders began his campaign for president. Yeah, it was a big shift. It's when all those Jacobin reading clubs building something towards the DSA really sort of mattered. If you go back and listen to, again, my show from this time period in 2014, I was actually talking about the IWW being what the DSA became. And the IWW's organizational limitations made that impossible. The reason why I wanted the IWW as the kind of clearinghouse of the remnants of the sectarian left and new places for activists to go is that it was going to be resistant to NGOism and to the Democratic Party and did not claim to be a party, which was going to be important. The SA doesn't claim to be a party, but resistant to NGOism And apart from the Democratic Party, it is not and has never been. All right, back to this. In a country where crisis was the most acute, where political contestation reached its loudest crescendo, left-wing populism flunked its biggest test. Syriza capitulated in Greece the same year. Interestingly, when we talk about Greece, Alex Hochuli and I have the same conclusion, but we come at it from different perspectives. And I'll get to that when we get to it. I was one of the people who thought that Grexit was an insane idea, that if they did try to do it, they were going to be betrayed one way or the other. I was just wrong about who's going to betray them. We'll get to that, though. For this generation, it seems as if the crisis was always arriving too early. We were always unprepared, both in ideas and organization. We didn't know what hit us. No one told us what politics was like this. Generation X was a generation that imbibed the failures of the boomers and the new left. Yes. I mean, also, it imbibed the failure of the fucking Soviet Union. It was a generation of the end of history. Also, to some degree, true. It was the generation of the end of history and the last man. The implications of what that atomization really would be began to really hit the Gen X in the form of personal rebellion and also niche political rebellions, but nothing with a coherent vision. This is really the failure of the Gen X, Lex, and Gen X anarchism and Gen X Trotskyism, etc. We'll get back to that later, but that's an important thing to consider. So millennials took a world without politics as a given until this was suddenly thrown into question in the 2010s. Asterisk. This is where I fundamentally disagree with this thesis. You do not have a world without politics after 2001 in the United States. After 9/11, you have a world without politics in which a bunch of millennials took as a given? No. They took as a given a state of siege politics. Or have we forgotten that? That bracketing out of this essay and these books strikes me as profoundly strange. The only person who really deals with it at all is Chris Catrone. Although it's interesting in some ways too, because one of the things I will notice is a lot of the discussion points in 2007, multipolarity, the relationship of imperialism, etc., which were frozen by the financial crisis. And a lot of those key figures, like people forget, but like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald were key figures back then. And even stuff like left-right coalitions against the war, libertarianism, and Paul Craig Roberts talking to Marxists, etc. This was a into the Bush era politics. And the recession and the quote anti-systemic movements, not all of which were from the left. The Tea Party, which I know I'm unpopular for saying this, was almost immediately after AstroTurf, began as a protest against George Bush's tax policy and his war policy. And its founders called it AstroTurf, like by the time it was really having an effect in U.S. politics by the midterms of the Obama administration. But that anti-systemic movement had begun earlier and turned into something else. But what I find interesting now is that a lot of the terms that we've talked about and a lot of the sectarian leanings, etc., which resemble the 2007 or even the 80s, seem like they come out of this frozen time period as if the years from 2008 to 2021 didn't happen, as if the COVID crisis kind of brought us back to the crises of initially were obvious in the end of the quote international rules-based order, and the Bush administration's breaking of treaty organizations, etc. Itself accelerated from stuff at the end of the 1990s with Bill Clinton, but nonetheless. So in a way, we've actually still gone back to the past. It's like the millennial left just didn't happen, and now we're picking up those old questions again, just like the Gen X left feels like it didn't happen, and we were picking up the new left questions again. So here we are, and there you are, and what do we do? Now, that's way too simple a way to see it. In a way, this is an easy way to frame it. In a way, that's also a misleading way to frame it. And I think we have to be pretty honest about that. All right. But I do think that admission is a big problem with this essay, and it's going to come up a lot. In terms of transmission of ideas derived from experience, a gulf separates us from previous generations of generational waves of activism from the new left to the 1960s, and before that, the old left in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, there's gulfs there too. That gulf called World War II and the Red Scare, and then the gulf called neoliberalism in the 80s. I mean, there's gulfs in all these things. It's almost like there's cycles of gulf and continuity and rupture, to use a John Manfred Paul book title, differently than he used it. Anyway, no one was there to hold our hand, except that Bernie Sanders was one of the people holding your hands, and he was definitely a figure of the younger end of the new left, and of a particular form of it, being critiqued by another end of the new left during his lifetime in the 80s. I mean, not just now. And yet, our failure might turn out to be the consequences of the fact that we were too beholden to the past without even knowing it. Alex, I think that's profound. I think it's also probably true. One of the things about not knowing the past is you don't really understand how you are repeating it, because the situations and pivotal moments where you have a decision point come up and you don't know to make a different one. Probably the one made in the past was the one that seems the most obvious, even if it's not the one you really leads to what you want. It's hard to ever know that, though. All right, we're going to do one more section and then we'll take a break. The millennial left can be periodized into three phases. Its prehistory concerns the anti-war movement of the 2000s. Yes, absolutely. Some of the biggest protests of the time. The election of Obama and the 2008 crash terminated what was then already lacking in energy and focus. Absolutely. In fact, it was already lacking in energy and focus by the fact that Democrats won in 2006 in Congress, which totally shifted the nature of the complaints. The second phase was marked by mass street protests and occupations. Oppositions to capitalism as such returned to the fore. Yeah, although initially as just a form of populism. I recall thinking at the time that the Occupy roster's appeal to the 99% seemed to herald a turn, opening to the majority of citizens, the people, after a decade to which left wing belonged to a minority subculture, standing away and opposed to mainstream society. Absolutely, and that standing away and opposed to the mainstream society had come from the idea that somehow the new left and the counterculture of the 1970s were the same thing, which was kind of an accident of timing more than one of sincere theory. Although the people who kind of believe that are the people who taught the Gen Xers in some ways, and there you go. The later half of the decade represents the third phase in which millennials began to reckon with power. Yeah, although poorly. I mean, this is just Varn talking. Both with a want for it and no understanding of it. On both sides of the Atlantic, the millennial leftists like Jacobin editor Bhaskar Sansara, Namara Media's Aaron Bastani began to talk about winning. Yeah, although the difference between Jacobin's trajectory and Navarra Media's trajectory is quite interesting. Given where they started off, Navarra Media was really tied into like Italian autonomia, Hart and Nagiri, a lot of the kind of ultra left radicalism, and ultra left here should be in quotation marks, of the Euro Marxist, post Euro Marxist, and an Italian autonomous period being refocused into first a kind of something that looked a lot like the Graeberite anarchism in America, although had a different intellectual superstructure, you might say. And then ending up more ensconced in the Labor Party than Bhaskar Sankara, despite his relationship to the Democratic Party and to later on to like the Nation Foundation, etc., did with Jacobin. In some ways, Bhaskar Sankara, coming out of Dissent magazine, was closer to the Democrats than Navarra Media was to Labor, but still further away today than Aaron Bastani is to Labor today, although they're on the losing end of Labor's battle, so thoroughly losing that it doesn't seem like there's a left to speak of in Britain anymore. Anyway, back to Hochuli. It seems obvious now, but the very notion of victory was a novel idea to a generation whose power was almost a dirty word. John Holloway, not a millennial, even wrote a book with young Gen Xers and all the millennials called Change the World Without Taking Power. asterisk, a disastrous idea. Yeah. But this was also a generation as late as 2010 when Malcolm Bull was writing books about passive revolution a la Gramsci. So anyway, what does the balance sheet in 2010 show? The global protest was followed by a financial crisis. From the nerve centers of global capitalism to the languishing peripheries was mostly non-ideological. The divorce from previous editions evinced its principal position. The rejection of old corrupt elites, the political class, and the establishment of La Casta. The establishment, not La Casta, the establishment La Casta. The millennial right did likewise, of course, and with greater success. Absolutely. And we can talk about that at the end of this piece. And protests that were amorphous, leaderless, and open to all corners, the right mobilized an anti-politics more effectively. And asterisk, they always had. They both mobilized it and neutralized it and recuperated it, and the whole cycle actually happened faster with the right. If you look at the Tea Party from 2007 to 2011, you can already see this. It is worth recalling that Leszek Kolakowski defined the right by its lack of utopianism, the feature that marked the left, and thus identified the right essentially with opportunism. Hence, the sword of judgment necessarily falls heavier on the left. I mean, by evoking Leszek Kolakowski here, one is invocating the idea of the left, which is a text basically kept in print by a Platypus Affiliated Society, of whom Chris Cutrone is affiliated. But I think it's actually useful here, even if I find that piece somewhat vulgar as an idea. The results of this anti-political model was countries left worse off than they started. Some resulted in bloody civil wars, Syria, Ukraine. Others in terrible restorations, Egypt, Brazil. Arguably, it was both. Egypt was a couple of different restorations. Even in the best case scenario, the changing was halting in fragile Tunisia, South Korea. I mean, South Korea, the conservative government's back in power. It's just a different one from the other different one, which was different from the other one. I find that all the discussion about the left and the right and the context of the Republic of Korea to be really lacking, but that's kind of a place where I've studied and lived. For others, the denouement would be more protracted and more tragic. In Greece, Spain, and Chile, the activists drove straight from the streets to the halls of power, seeking to institutionalize their demands. Absolutely. Remember Kasama Project's celebration of Syriza, if you even remember who Kasama Project was. One of the things about this is like the DSA kind of wiped the memory out of the various kinds of Marxist and non-Marxist political powers in the U.S. left beforehand, so much that people can complain about somehow like neo-anarchism becoming a problem in 2019 where it wasn't a problem in 2012, which means you know nothing about U.S. politics and the political left in America, which has always had an anarchistic tinge. I mean, even its Stalinism had an anarchistic tinge. I mean, they were Stalinist syndicalists, for God's sakes. All right. In the latter of the three, the grand promise that neoliberalism would die in the very country which had first implemented it was not delivered upon. I'm not sure that you can say that neoliberalism was first implemented by Pinochet, my friend. That's an interesting claim. A gleeful left overloaded a proposed constitution with pet concerns, and the Chilean masses rejected it. Thank you, Boric. In Spain, the indignatos that occupied the squares birthed an actual party, Podemos. Yeah, that didn't go well. And I remember people being really ecstatic about that. See Tom O'Brien and me arguing about that in 2012. It ended up as a junior coalition partner to the very party, the PSOE, that it held culpable for the neoliberal turn, which it aimed to displace. Asterisk. I do think people should go back and reread Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine, because while she doesn't realize what she's documenting and views it as a neoliberal conspiracy, she actually documents that it's the kind of center-left parties that always neoliberalize more than the center-right ones, and she can't seem to figure out why. I think I have an idea why, and that's because neoliberalism is actually tied to Fordism in a key way, and thus to Keynesianism, and its reliance on public-private partnerships. And thus, it's really easy when you have a lot of state control over those public-private partnerships to flip the switch and push labor out very quickly. It took a little bit more time in the United States, actually, than some other places, which I think surprises people, given that we drove it so much to make sure that, like, the Fordist, model of developmentalism wasn't adopted in so many other places. Nonetheless, Alex Tsipras' betrayal provided a defining moment, a bigger blow to the left than Thatcher, and the assessment of former Syriza finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, who saw it all from the inside. I think we're both. I tend to think Yanis was both right and wrong simultaneously. I do not have the love of Yanis Varoufakis as so many people do. One making making a jet setter like him the key figure of your left movement, while also not acknowledging he got outsmarted by Tsipras, and that uh, a lot of the stuff he set up led to the ability for that to happen and the troika to be even more punitive, etc. It was a bigger blow to the left than Thatcher, but Varoufakis was part of the blow, and we should hold him somewhat accountable for it, even though he was way better than Tsipras. We also should ask ourselves, like, what we could do. Greece is only an extreme case in what went across and beyond the West. The populace, exhausted by neoliberal austerity and angry at the lack of democratic accountability and meaningful participation, was ready finally to ditch the old and make a play for the new. The moment had arrived. The millennial left could not lead. And in the first instance, they rejected the idea of leadership, and in the second, it refused the sort of rupture necessary for serious reform. Yeah. So you either have total rupture or no rupture at all. Oscillating pivot back and forth in one generation, which had been an oscillating pivot back and forth in the generations prior. I mean, in some way, one of the things that make millennial left so fascinating is that you see the long delay mistakes of other lefts being recuperated in farce and very quickly. Its unpreparedness, some would say opportunism, has led the left back to the marginal subcultural position it had sought to escape. Absolutely. Greece provides, again, a crystalline example. In Syriza's second mandate, after it had swallowed the whole of the Troika's deadly memorandum, thereby turning its majority of its citizens who rejected austerity and the diktat from the Eurogroup and the International Financial Institution, the party turned back to easy fights like moral war against corruption and post-material reforms around sexuality, gender, and so on. Asterisk. Sexuality and gender are not post-material. Sorry. Now, symbolic sexuality and gender are, and so you could say, like, symbolic reforms around sexuality and gender that don't affect social reproduction at all. Yes, that's not material, but social reproduction is the basis of material society in the way that production is. You cannot separate the two, even, really. Sorry, buddy. That's something you got to take more seriously. Now, I do think a lot of what Syriza actually ended up doing was ephemeral, and for reasons that's probably implied by Alex Hochuli here, but he needs to go into more detail to really justify. It became concerned with implementing austerity in a sensitive manner, which almost everyone does. I mean, this was also the case in the Chilean left post Pinochet. In the 1990s, something that's also bracketed out of this discussion as if we went directly from Pinochet to Boric. Rejecting the old left sectarianism, the party wished to be pragmatic, but remarkably quietly, let's say the government became, let's govern at any cost. This could serve as left populism's epithet well beyond Greece. I think that's fair. In final analysis, the left became the last defender of neoliberalism, not its undertaker. Not totally sure on that. I'm not sure that we can say that the left was the defender of neoliberalism, although maybe it is, in so much that neoliberal institutions seem to be the only internationalist institution on the stage, and thus defending internationalist institutions, even if they're ones we shouldn't defend, become the only way people can seem to break out against right-wing nationalism, and thus maybe there is some truth to the last defender of elements of neoliberalism, but other elements that are pretty maintained by right-wingers, guys. For all its denunciation, it was incapable of imagining anything else, question mark. Too many of its practices reflected back on some of the worst features of the current order. Short-termism, that's not endemic. These are not just left problems. A bias against political programs, also not a left problem. In fact, in the right, it's actually a bias for personalities against political programs because political programs speak of ideology, which the right rejects. Mass organizations and institution building, yeah, that's endemic to society right now because it's hard to build institutions. It's not the left doesn't want to; it's incapable of it. You can accuse the gray bright left of not wanting to, but that's not true for the DSA. They really wanted to build some fucking institutions, and they can't. A reliance on the media and charismatic leaders, yes, but again, that's not unique to the left. That seems to be endemic to society right now. See the kinds of leaders that the right has produced from Berlusconi to even Duterte to Trump. Like there is a over focused on Bonapartism because of the fractured nature of the class coalitions which make up these groups, and there's a reliance on media because there's very little other civic organizations to build power bases from. I mean, that's actually implicit in some of Anton Yeager's work. I don't think Yeager goes enough into why Robert Putnam was correct, but that Robert Putnam was kind of correct is something to look at. This is why in the 2010s are a historic missed opportunity when, amid the signs of mass revolt for the first time in decades, the ostensible forces of utopianism sought to change the content of politics without changing the neoliberal shell that contained it. It was an omelet without breaking any eggs. I mean, it was worse than that, really. It was an omelet without eggs at all. Anyway, this is a good place to stop as any. I have much to say on this essay, and we have not even gotten to the reviews yet. On that note, like and subscribe. At Varnblog, we have multi-levels of patronage if you'd like to support us here. And we have a $3 level, which gives you audio to everything in release and a couple of additional free audio episodes a month. We have a $5 level, which gives you additional video episodes as well. And we have a $10 level, which enables you to vote on certain things occasionally, if you are so inclined, to get things to do shows with me, and frankly, to get this thanks, which I need to do today. I would like to thank the following patrons: Adriel M, Brandon L, Danny from the Valley, and DRV. Thank you for your support, and I hope you all have a great rest of your evening. And follow us as we finish this, and we'll go back to do some more of Judge Sabo's on authority, and then we'll do some other articles as well, both contemporary, and I'm going to do more from the past. I would do them in nailing it down, but my nailing it down on the critique of the Goethe program history might take me a year to do all of what I want to do in the detail I want to do it in. And I realize that's costing me show watches, but I don't give a shit because I don't do this for immediate payoff. All right. Thank you so much. And please like it, comment, hit the bell, and share this. I'm not on Twitter anymore. I have noticed it's affected my view count. I don't really care about my view count in some ways, but I don't do this to hear my own voice. So, on that note, have a great day.